Have you ever just stopped and wondered why some countries are all about massive oil fields while others are covered in wind farms or powered by nuclear reactors? Well, it's definitely not random. Turns out every single nation has its own energy fingerprint. And today, we're going to break down the recipe that makes them all so different.
Yeah, you can think of a country's energy strategy like a really complex recipe. It all comes down to a specific set of 6 key ingredients that pretty much dictate what fuels their society. And once you understand these ingredients, you can decode the entire global energy map.
So that's what we're going to dig into. To really get a handle on any country's energy choices, you have to understand these 6 fundamental factors, the ingredients that make up their recipe. Let's break them down.
Okay, here they are. You've got physical availability, cost, technology, public perception, economic development, and last but not least, environmental priorities. We're about to go through each one of these to see how they mix together to create a country's totally unique energy profile.
First up is the most obvious one, right? Physical availability. It's really simple. What does a country have right there, under its own soil or blowing across its landscape? You know, if you're sitting on a mountain of coal or you've got endless sunshine, that's your natural starting point. It's basically the hand you're dealt by geography.
All right, ingredient number 2. Cost. For literally centuries, this was the kingmaker. The reason fossil fuels totally dominated was because they were just cheap to get out of the ground and they produced a ton of energy. But what's so interesting now is that this ingredient is changing, and fast. The cost of renewables like solar and wind is just plummeting, which makes them a way more competitive choice.
And that brings us to our third ingredient, technology. This one is the great unlocker. I mean, think about it. Deep-sea oil rigs, fracking for natural gas, or those super-efficient solar panels. Technology doesn't just make energy cheaper. It can make resources that were totally out of reach suddenly available, completely rewriting a nation's energy playbook. Then you've got public perception. And this one is all about how people feel. A huge event like the Fukushima nuclear disaster could just turn public opinion against nuclear power almost overnight, forcing governments to completely change direction. But on the flip side, as more people become aware of climate change, you get this massive public support for renewables that pushes politicians to invest.
Our 5th ingredient is economic development. It makes sense, right? A wealthy, industrialized nation with big cities, tons of factories, and millions of cars on the road, it just uses way more energy. Their high demand, plus their money, lets them build these really complex energy grids and invest in all sorts of sources, from massive dams to advanced nuclear plants.
And finally, our 6th ingredient, and this one is becoming a huge deal. Environmental priorities. As more and more countries commit to climate targets like the Paris Agreement, their governments are actively creating policies to phase out fossil fuels and seriously boost renewals. The key thing here is this isn't some side issue anymore. It's a main ingredient that's shaping the future.
Okay, so now we have our 6 ingredients. Let's see how they actually get mixed in the real world to cook up a national strategy. We're going to start with the United States, a true energy giant.
So just look at this profile. The U.S. recipe starts with a massive helping of physical availability. We're talking huge domestic reserves of coal, oil, and gas. Then you add a big dose of technology, like fracking, which unlocked even more. You combine that with a relatively low cost and a highly developed economy that is just hungry for energy, and what you get is a mix that is super heavy on fossil fuels. The final ingredients, public opinion and environmental policy, well, they're kind of mixed, which has slowed down the shift away from this traditional recipe.
Now let's head over to a completely different kitchen. This next profile shows how you can take the exact same ingredients, mix them differently, and get a wildly different result. Let's check out the recipe for France. So France's recipe starts from a place of scarcity. Look at that first ingredient, very limited fossil fuels. This pretty much forced them to get creative. So decades ago, they made a huge strategic bet on technology, specifically nuclear power. That decision was backed up by public perception and then reinforced by some really strong environmental priorities to keep emissions low. And the outcome? A recipe for low-carbon energy security built not on what they had in the ground, but on strategic choice.
And this just lays it all out, doesn't it? 2 totally different paths. The U.S. strategy was basically to cash in on its natural wealth of fossil fuels. It was a recipe based on abundance. France, on the other hand, had to engineer its way out of a problem. Their recipe was all about overcoming scarcity with technology and really strong government policy.
So why does any of this really matter?
Well, it's absolutely crucial because these national recipes don't just exist in a bubble. They have enormous consequences for energy security, the global economy, and maybe most importantly, for our climate.
And here's the proof. Because of its nuclear-heavy recipe, France's energy mix has a much lower carbon intensity. That means for every bit of energy it produces, it releases way fewer greenhouse gases than the United States. This shows you the powerful real-world impact of choosing different ingredients for your national energy plan.
So what's the big takeaway here? First, just remember that every country's energy mix is a unique recipe made from those 6 key ingredients. Second, even though having a ton of natural resources is a huge advantage, it's not destiny. Things like policy, technology, and public opinion can completely change the final dish. And finally, these choices matter a lot. They affect everything from national security all the way to the future of our planet.
And all this leaves us with one last, really fascinating question. You see, the ingredients themselves are always changing. The cost of solar is dropping through the floor, new fusion technologies are on the horizon, and environmental goals are getting more urgent every day. So as we look ahead, how are these evolving factors going to reshape our national recipes? And what will the world's energy menu even look like in the decades to come?